Tammie, you had said that you're for the Arkansas Department of Emergency what?
I work for Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality.
Environmental Quality.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm sorry. All right, you said you know where the hazardous materials are being put and how they're being handled. I would like to know where they're being put and how they're being handled so they don't leak hazmat into the landfills.
Sure, no, absolutely. There's a pump station that ExxonMobil owns. It's about 65 acres. It's out on Highway 36. The Joint Information Center, obviously ADEQ being part of that, EPA, we felt it was important to get all of the, once the oil and the oil waters and contaminated soils and debris, some rocks and things like that, once that has all been collected, we didn't want that to disperse intermingling among the community. We wanted it in one collective area where it could be behind fenced, have security, be able to do the walkthroughs and so forth. So that pump station out there on Highway 36 is actually where everything was taken. Once it was collected, it was moved out there. There's a tracking inventory of it. We have an inspector out there daily walking around, as well as we're requiring the Exxon folks to track by frac tank number and content. The solid waste, non-liquid, non-liquid, did not test hazardous, went to the Saline County landfill. They are under a solid waste permit with the Solid Waste Division of ADEQ. And so they were allowed to take that type material. They take all that type debris, rocks, the trees, and things like that. The oil water mixtures, some of it is tested hazardous. That was really primarily some of the ones that were pumped up at the onset of the spill, as you can imagine. Obviously had a higher content of the oil versus the water. That tested hazardous. That went to a controlled hazardous waste permitted, what we call a treatment, storage, and disposal facility. That is located in Haskell, Arkansas. They have a permit, they have controls, they're oversighted by ADEQ. We actually have an inspector that's out there all the time around the clock, and then we have other inspectors from the other medias, you know, they go out there periodically about twice a year for the statutory requirement. So that's where your hazardous liquid waste is going.
It's all being monitored, so it's not going to be rained on and then flow down into the water.
It's actually in controlled. Your solids are what they call roll-offs, but they're still boxes. They have lids over them. They're setting in a little temporary containment area. They're being monitored daily, like I said, by our inspectors going out there, as well as us checking the inspection logs that we require Exxon to do.
I did notice on Highway 80, the old Highway 365, right next to where the horse farm is, there were a lot of trucks there, and every time I would drive through there, I would smell that same smell. Now, is that, I don't know where Highway 36 is, but is that where some of your stuff was taken from Exxon?
That's actually a different area. Highway 36, and obviously I'm kind of geographically challenged, but it's more like toward Bologna area.
30, okay. What was it right
What
there?
you're seeing, I believe, is what they refer to as the hilltop area.
Yes.
That was one of the original temporary staging areas where they had solids. There were no liquids out there, to my knowledge, but they were storing some of the solids. Again, that would be anywhere from some of the rocks, the vegetative, oily vegetation that was pulled out of some of the stream around North Main, and then the subway ditch that Scott was referring to. Some of those areas had some oily stained vegetation, so that was actually removed and placed into these still boxes. They were staged out there temporarily until we could get them out to Highway 36.
Okay, so I go back and forth through work that way, and I would get that same smell every time I would drive past there, and I heard that some of the horses there have come and sit, and I was going to be boarding my horse there, but of course I'm not going to do that now. I had one other question for you. Can you get the health department to visit the Mayflower residents? Since you say you work with the people at the health department, why can't we get the health department to come out and help us at our city?
It's not the health department.
Well, she said she was on the team lead with for
The Arkansas Department of Health is one of our support agencies.
Right.
They've been working with us. They've been advising a lot of the citizens within the immediate impact area because of some of the air monitoring activities. Obviously, we defer to them from a health level and so forth. Certainly, if you want to make a request for the health department to come out and meet with you and talk about some issues, please give me your name and number, and I can pass that information on.
Okay, but I would like it not just with me, but with everybody. All of the Mayflower residents are talking about being sick. Just because we don't live in Northwoods doesn't mean we were not affected by this.
I understand what you're saying, and I certainly can pass on that request.
Okay.
At the back here, the gentleman.
Tammie, you mentioned that the emergency response phase was over. Is that correct?
Well, I'd say for about 3/4 of the incident areas.
Okay, next part of my question. Once that's over, you mentioned, say it's finished. Just go ahead and say it's finished, hypothetically. Then you're going to issue Exxon an order. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. As far as that order is concerned, what was done during this whole process to measure the amount of material that was removed?
Well, I think I understand your question. If I missed the point, please ask for clarification.
Let me clarify. What I'm getting at is, what have we done as Arkansans to measure what was removed from these wetlands so that we can say, okay, Exxon, this is A, now make this A. The same amount that you took out, now you're going to put back. Where's it going to come from? Do you see what I'm getting at? How did we measure what they removed so that we can hold them accountable for what they took away from us that was ours to begin with?
That's a valid question and a good question. I'll answer that twofold. I say that one of the best ways we're going to measure that is when you get into the wetland areas back there, the marsh area, the cove area of Lake Conway. We've been dealing with a trust that owns a portion of that property, as well as discussions, obviously, with Game and Fish being one of the parties at the table with us as a support agency. They know the lay of the land. That's their land. So they knew what they had. They know what they want it to return to be. So certainly we're deferring to them in that area as we get into the transitioning phase into the long-term remediation. The second way that we're going to quantify that is we have records. I was talking with this lady up here. We have all the inventory records. We know how much vegetation was pulled out, where it was pulled from. We know the stones, we know the soils, the trees, the oils, the waters. So, we have the inventory of that. So we have kind of a measurement of what all collectively was pulled out. And then we've got a record of where that came from.
In the early part of your presentation, you mentioned that ADEQ, I believe I'm right, I may be wrong, correct me if I am, conducted air quality at the time it happened and up until now. Am I correct that y'all are still doing air quality monitoring?
EPA and their contractor, because they actually had the equipment to come in and do some of the air monitoring within the community.
So EPA did it, right?
They've been doing
Okay.
air monitoring as well as ExxonMobil.
When they first started it, when did they start monitoring it? You know the day of the spill, the next day after the spill?
I want to say
Third
the
day.
evening of the 29th is when the first, and April, May now, I think, when EPA had their contractors down
My
there.
main question is, what were the toxic levels on the first day they did it?
Okay,
What were the levels?
I certainly cannot quote that, but I can point you to that area or get that information for you. We have it posted on our website.
Well, I know what April's people have done. We've seen what
Sure.
their quality stuff was, which, if you look at it, if you can't understand it, it makes you sick. It's scary to death. I want to know what EPA did. I want to know what their results said.
If I said those are available
Because
on
I
our
haven't
website,
seen theirs.
What website?
ADEQ
Exxon,
website,
Yeah.
It's just ADEQ.gov.
www.adeq.state.ar.us. If you'll look over to the right-hand side when you pull the website up, you'll see like a hot topic area, and one of the first things there talks about the Mayflower pipeline incident.
So you understand my question?
Yes, ma'am.
You know, that to me, that has never really been, I haven't heard it come up until we finally saw it on the news, on TV about 2 weeks after the spill, when Exxon finally admitted what was in this stuff that we're breathing. It didn't say.
The results on their website, is that not for an 8-hour adult? Not for the residents that live in that area? Those statistics are based on
Yeah.
an 8-hour work working adult, not for residents?
There's two types of air data that you're gonna see out on our website. And I'm gonna answer this as best I can, but obviously the air program is not my forte. But it's what they call real-time air monitoring, and that's somebody actually going out with a piece of equipment. And if you made some of the community meetings that the Unified Command held, we actually had the instruments there. Real time, it just basically sniffs the air right there where you are, wherever you're setting the level of the monitor, it will tell you what's in that air right there that you're breathing. That data is posted on our website. Then they had some monitors set up within the community, and those did different real-time air monitoring draws. They did like a nighttime shift, and they had like a daytime shift. So I'd say it was like an 8 to 12 hour span.
Okay, so what, and this is a question I'm just raising, what about the residents that are staying there and the small children that were staying there 24 hours a day? It wasn't an 8-hour span. That's been my biggest issue the whole time.
And I understand it, again, not my area of expertise, I'm gonna try to answer it as best I can, and I can get somebody else to talk to you in more detail. But you had a day shift sample and you had a night shift sample.
Right.
There's ways that the scientists will look at that air data, will then put those two together, where you're getting collective real-time data for a 24-hour period. And then if they're doing that every day. But I certainly understand your concern, and I can certainly try to find somebody to make
Well, yeah, the workers were evacuated twice within this whole ordeal. But again, workers were evacuated on a baseline of 8 hours a day, workday, adult people. And then you have the residents in the area, which are there maybe 24 hours a day with their kids. And none of the area except for the main street that had the oil slick, I live in Northwoods. I never got knocked on my door saying I need to evacuate ever. And I live one street over. Why?
You know,
I mean, I know that it may not be your area of expertise, but I think this is like the biggest concern for a mother and living in that area. I mean, there's a lot of my a lot of my friends and residents, neighbors that are still there in Northwoods. And there's a lot of people outside the area that still aren't even getting noticed or talked about. I think that somebody had said, you know, the health department coming out and doing a community type of health evaluation needs to happen if it hasn't already. It should have happened a long time ago.
we should make a
And
call
I'm certainly
then.
going to pass that request on. I mean, obviously, you know, it's
They
a
didn't test
state
in the
agency,
COVID
but
2
I am
weeks
going to
ago.
pass that request on.
Yes, why did you spray so much water on the tar sands when all it did was increase the amount of liquid waste that you had to dispose of?
ADEQ did not spray the water on the tar sands. That was a decision made within the Unified Command
Yes,
as a technology that was effective in treating that.
and ADEQ signed off on it as part of the.
We were a fourth of the sign off on that, yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier in your talk about testing wells in the area. How would a person go about getting their well tested? I mean, no, I got a well there, it's been there 80 to 100 years, nobody ever tested it. And it's 300 feet from what y'all call the code.
Sure. Typically, the health department tests the drinking water wells. The wells that I was referring to were what we call temporary wells. They're like monitoring wells that we put in around spill release sites to try to get a picture of the groundwater within that area that's flowing through and leaving that area.
Wouldn't
See what
testing
kind of
it-
constituents we might have.
Wouldn't testing a 3-foot well that's 60 to 80 feet deep is below the water level of the code, water's gonna seep into that well. That's why it's always had water in it. I mean, that'd be a perfect spot to test it, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to
200
say it's a
feet.
bad spot to monitor it, but again, the focus of that phase of the emergency response and the groundwater investigation we were doing was with, those wells are placed behind those, 7 to 8 homes, though at the Northwood area, where we had the major impact release from the pipeline.
But those wells would be at best wouldn't do very good.
Again, if I had a name and address, I could pass that on to the health department. I mean, again, I can make that request.
Well, doesn't the health department only check for things like E. coli, if they don't check for VOCs?
It's not really fair to ask her a lot of questions about what other agencies do or don't do. I think she really deserves our appreciation that she's here today. Thank you so much. for coming and doing your best to share information, but it's really not fair to ask her what other agencies do or don't do.
I got some now.
Just one more question about the, and this to just kind of follow up on something Scott said that stuck me. He said that he's not at this point allowed to do any additional testing. And so I guess my question would be, and if you can answer it or directly, who's deciding what testing? Is the testing being done only by you guys and Exxon? And I guess you all have decided at what spots, what intervals. And if that's the case, what has to be done in order to get independent testing approved? I'm not clear on why the judge has decided that there's no need for additional independent testing.
Yeah, and I can't obviously speak for the judge, and I wasn't aware of that. That was the first time I heard about that.
How you all decide what testing is being, if you all actually do testing, and then is ADEQ and Exxon, are you guys the only one allowed to do the testing, and are you all still doing it at certain intervals, or give me some idea about what you decided about the testing?
Sure. The answer to is ADEQ still collecting samples?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
We are collecting surface water samples, and then we're collecting groundwater samples from those temporary wells that I talked about within the Northwood subdivision.
Okay.
EPA has been involved in collecting some of the air monitoring sampling, and then the health department has been assisting us in doing the review of that data, and then talking with any individuals that had concerns about those results. Exxon is pulling anywhere from soil samples, from a shallow down into the subsurface area, groundwater samples, surface water samples. Then they're going to have to continue to do more surface water sampling, sediment sampling, and things of that nature as we transition. To answer your question of why just ADEQ and the feds and the Exxon, it is our regulatory obligation, both from a state and federal level, to ensure that the data that's being collected and analyzed is good data and valid data, and that it gives us that gauge of what actions we may or may not need to take sooner than later type concept. We have statutory authority to go in anywhere to collect samples, to abate situations for protection of human health and the environment for the citizens of the state of Arkansas. And obviously the feds carry that same type of authority.
It would seem that perhaps a little more concentration on the water column rather than just surface testing might be something that would be advisable.
We are pulling water column samples. We've been pulling water column samples. We've been required Exxon to pull water column samples. Yes. And we've been doing that at the locations and the request of Game and Fish.
Ma'am, do you get the Exxon newsletter?
I don't.
Oh, okay, well, there's a place on there with a phone number.
That's a Log County Democrat, isn't it?
I called them, asked for a test to be done in my house, and they came in and did the little hand warm test thing, and then I was told that was really not adequate because it doesn't measure parts per billion, it only measures parts per million.
You can get
So
the,
then I requested a canister test, and they came out and they set canisters up in my house for 24 hours and one outside my house for 24 hours. Have not heard of the results yet, but you can have your house tested, but just call them and tell them you want to test it. You tell them you want the canister test.
that's what we did at ours.
But I think though, the concern I have is that you only have certain vehicles
Yeah.
used to get the testing done. And it seems like at some point we have to push to have independent testing continue. If there's some type certification or regulatory issue, then we need to know and jump that hurdle so that we can then go ahead and move forward with the independent testing. Because
Exxon sent someone, and I don't remember their name, but it was not Exxon that actually did the testing.
CTEH, I believe.
That's what that's
Center for
right.
Toxicology, Environmental Health.
Right.
Yeah, they're a company that's in Northville, Rock, but they were subcontracted.
But there was an
I'm
independent
really
company
sorry
come
to
out
have
of
to
our
start
home.
cutting this down, but we do have one more presentation, and some people are going to have to be able to leave.
Bioaccumulation though, it's bioaccumulation in the water column. It's not instantaneous grab samples in the water column. It's putting something that they're in the water column that mimics life in plants and what's the pattern over time and how do the contaminants and solvents accumulate over time after a rainfall. So just you make a great point.
Yes, correct.
I was just curious that when y'all showed up on the scene, how did they assign the perimeter that y'all were supposed to, test?
That was part of my.
I mean, because we live 300 yards on the back side of where the rupture site actually was, and I've never seen any of y'all over my yard.
Yeah.
Not once.
And been over there.
And I was just curious how they assigned y'all's perimeter, if they said, okay, we want y'all to take your machines out and scan this area.
The scope of the air monitoring, I honestly cannot speak to that. Those were established by EPA and their contractors when they came into town that night of the spill. And I was referring to that area
I
expertise.
can speak on that. I met with Exxon and asked them that question. It was based on a model developed by Exxon in conjunction with EPA Region 6. So they collectively decided what that perimeter was going to be and how far out it should go. I advocated for them to come back on smells and do their monitoring there. We're still advocating for them to test some homes, inside some homes out there. But again, as a resident, you have to contact them and request indoor air monitoring, and it does need to be canister sampling. Our position is that handheld monitoring and real-time monitoring using some of these types of devices that monitor in part per million sampling and have to be calibrated, so they have to be set.
Yeah, but they called our church that's across the street and asked them if they could come over and do their testing, but we didn't have to call them.
Yeah, I mean,
I guess what both of our questions are is the criteria is when it hit, and that was still broken. Who were they saying was just mainly affected? The people on Starlight?
Yes.
Or was anybody else going to be affected?
Yeah.
Whereas we all were smelling the fumes and we're still smelling. Honestly, if the wind's right, you can still smell it.
Yeah.
You still get sick while you
Yeah, I mean, we've all been sick.
We have a couple of questions I want to make sure that we get to. The gentleman at the back.
Okay, I got a question. Now, you're with the ADEQ, right? Okay. The lady, yes ma'am. Okay, now, to my knowledge, when Arkansas Health Department came out and basically did what they were gonna do, they did not find, they were helping Exxon versus doing their own independent studies. I live in the Northwood subdivision, right? And I live on Northwoods. So when you come in the subdivision, I live right there on Northwood Drive. Okay, Woodside Drive, my bad. I live on Woodside Drive. Now, the houses directly behind me, because I live on that strip, the conduits got flooded on both sides of the street with the oil contamination. Now, because there's a fence that my neighbors put up, they never checked the conduits going through the other side of the neighborhood. Basically, from my neighbor's house where they checked it and pulled up the driveways, they never checked the rest of the conduits out on my side and further. Because the oil leaked all up under their conduits, got onto their pipes, they're evacuated. Now, I'm sitting on top of a house that could possibly have that oil on the conduits, and they never checked it. And that's a guaranteed fact. I'm there every day.
Are you talking
So-
about that privacy fence back there?
Yeah, no, not their privacy fence, my neighbor's fence. I live on that main strip. As soon as you come in Northwoods, I live on that strip. Both sides, Starlight and my house are basically right there. And the only thing the reason why they checked it, and this is what they said. They, is meaning Exxon, said, well, there's a fence there. So I'm telling you, all the air quality and everything else, that fence stopped it. That magical bubble of that fence line stopped everything from our side of the street over. And if that makes sense, does that make sense when you're understanding that the conduits run all through the neighborhood? So how far does the oil actually drag upon those pipes and the sewer line, the water line, and everything else? They stop right there because of that magical fence that the neighbors put up.
I would need to get a clear depiction of actually where your home is and sit down with a map with you, but they actually followed the conduit the entire length of the street, the storm drainage area. They traced it all the way until it exited the neighborhood over to North Main.
See, that's on that side. They followed that conduit. But actually, the oil actually went up under the ground and got onto the ones right, Starlight. Then there's the houses on this side of Starlight. Oil leaked on this side of the street, right? I live on this side of the street, on that main strip. The oil got up into their conduits as well, so I know for a fact it had to come over.
I'd be glad, again, to get your address and can sit down and talk with Exxon and look at the amounts. Now, we're still working in the residential area.
Now, see, that's the whole thing. The residential area, Exxon says they're doing this, but they're tearing up all the roads. Regardless, those roads are not meant to have those type of trucks. Exxon sits their trucks out there with the trucks running, and they won't do the air quality test because I'm sitting right there watching them. They're doing it because they don't want to do it while the trucks are still running. And they got the dumps and everything else is running. It's still killing air control. And they're saying, well, we want to wait for a while until we get all this stuff out the way to do more air quality testing. And I'm sitting right there. There's no ifs, ands, buts about it. It's right there. And you don't get any answers, and you say, well, call Exxon, figure it out. Exxon is not talking to nobody. They're not talking. And I'm sitting right there, and I complain at them every day.
They were invited to attend today and last month, and we reached out to them.
And Arkansas is not doing anything to force their hands. If you're on the board, ask your higher-ups to help force them to force their hands to come on over. That's the simplest thing that we can do. We have a governor that got put out our own subdivision, but our attorney general said, man, y'all not finna tell me what to do. How is that possible? I mean, I know that's at a higher level, but they're not testing everything. We're not getting up, and as Arkansans, let me put it like that, as Arkansans, only one person is basically helping. Everybody else is on Exxon's side because Arkansas is a big business state. It's for the big businesses. It's not to help the little people out, because if they were doing the right thing, our Arkansas Health Department would have been right there around the whole entire Mayflower. Yes, the oil spill on property, but the air quality control, the real testing that they're not doing, that's the Arkansas Department. That's actually their department, and they're not doing anything because they're saying we're helping Exxon.
Well,
There's no indication. There's no clear.
The health department has been at the Joint Incident Command Center as a support agency for the state of
But that's not
Arkansas.
supposed to be support.
For the state of Arkansas, as I tried to explain, the way that the emergency support function system is set up within the state of Arkansas, ADEQ for oil spills is the primary agency. We have 20 to 22 support agencies that come out and offer support for their areas of expertise. The health department has been looking at all the air data, not just that within the individualized homes. They've been consulting and advising ADEQ as the on-scene coordinator and primary agency of all the plans, of all the directions, and of all the levels on what actions did or did not need to be taken. But again, I would love to get your specific name and number, and I'll take your concern back, and we'll try to address any concerns that you have. I can't resolve those.
I understand that. That's what, but I'm making it aware of things that are not happening.
I understand.
And the health department was also invited to be here today, and they have received the report from the first town hall, which one of the main priorities was to request that comprehensive community health assessment, which would take into consideration concerns like yours, because you're absolutely right, you cannot put a fence around air quality.
Okay, one more in the back.
I have two, then they're real quick.
Okay.
One is who controls how we set the monitors to test the air? And the second is, other than Scott, who has taken the time to test Pullarm Creek area for oil compounds or anything like that.
Well, ADEQ specifically has had their scientists out there collecting below the dam area in Plum Creek, as well as I understand we have an actual station out there that's tested several times throughout the year, so we actually had some background data for that area, and then we've been collecting that as one of our stations.
The Bell Slough area and
Yeah, just
Plum
below the
Creek
dam area. And
Yes.
we have a map actually on that website. In the very top paragraph, it's got a link to a map, and it will show that location just below the dam.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, the first part of your question was?
It's who sets the limits on who controls the actual amounts or parts per billion or parts per million of your air monitors that you use? Who is in control of that, and who says if you're gonna set it at this limit, or who says you're not gonna set it at this limit? Or is that?
I think it depends on the instrument that's being utilized.
Okay.
When I talk about the real-time data where they're taking a handheld equipment out there and basically snipping what you're breathing right then.
Correct.
Those typically are parts per million. That's just the nature of that equipment.
Okay.
It's a good screening tool. I agree with what April and Scott have said. It's not necessarily the sensitive tool where you want to get down into the nitty-gritty of things. The suma canisters and then the bucket thing that April showed you, my understanding is those are set at a more sensitive level. They're parts per billion. And those are typically what you want in the home. We typically, through EPA, will have them run like a 24-hour period to get a good draw of what's occurring.
This bucket has been approved by the EPA. They sanction it. It's a tool that's very widely used. It's not cheap.
No.
To
Can we
analyze.
build our own?
We build these buckets.
Okay.
Yeah, now there's an expense in it. The sampling, the analyzing is the real cost. To have it broken down, these handheld monitors that were being used really frequently in those first few weeks, they calibrate those. And they are not equipped to break down all of the compounds in the air. You have to have a laboratory to be able to do that, which is why these are more efficient, but it's also why they're more costly.
Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you.
I just wanted to see if part of her question was, who sets the standards? What authority sets the limits that should be there? It's
Like the levels that we would compare it to?
Yeah.
Those are typically set by EPA. If you're looking at a work situation, you've probably heard of OSHA standards, you've heard of NIOSH. All different type levels are set by different agencies depending on the situation. But typically within the home, EPA is involved in natural science
Yeah, but
data.
I know that Arkansas has lower pollution standards than some of the federal standards.
That's why,
And Arkansas does not test for a lot of, Arkansas ADEQ does not test water or air for a lot of the things that could be tested. And so, the question is, how can we get better standards for the state of Arkansas? Do those require ADEQ rule changes, or law changes, or what?
it's with the state legislature.
Law
The
changes.
state legislature sets the amount of funding that goes to the various agencies to perform air monitoring. I met with areas in the ADEQ that was very forthcoming, very
One more thing, are those laws have to basically be kind of approved by our lovely all-industry and all-agency, non-citizen oil and gas commission?
There is a lot of pushback from the industry when new regulations and more standards and more thorough testing is.
But this would be pollution control and ecology. And that is one of the legislative avenues that needs to be considered, because sometimes it's simpler to go in and make a rule change in changing the standards than it will be in the legislative action itself.
But by using different standards from state to state, like some of those standards I was mentioning, the Louisiana ambient air standard, the Texas standards, different states, EPA has standards. Many of them are occupational standards. Each state will have its own standards based on the type of funding and what they have put into developing those standards and the science behind why they're wanting to implement them. So Arkansas does have a lot of work to do to try to kind of catch up with some of the other states in the air monitoring.
Okay, and one more thing, I'm sorry, I know you're going, but isn't it true that ADEQ is not proactive? It won't change its own rules. The public has to come and request a rule change.
That's us.
We have to press you all to do it, am I right?
Well,
I want to criticize.
I would disagree with that, because I think if we see a need from a regulatory standpoint to change the rules, we have taken those measures. We've developed more stringent rules within my program area for the Hazardous Waste Act, in addition to the federal requirements. We've become more stringent in a lot of areas. Yeah, we do have a rulemaking that's called third-party rulemaking. For citizens and folks that want to approach and change a rule that we maybe have to adopt as is. EPA has mandatory adoptions, and they have, you can't if you want to type adoptions. So obviously for those mandatory adoptions, sometimes we can be more stringent, but we have to at least do what they say. So there are measures for third-party rulemaking, but we have to be more active in the areas that we felt there was a need. And obviously we get input from a lot of communities.
Joyce, I have a yes or no question. Can I just real quickly? Tammie, in the determining of whether the waste is hazardous or not, you all test for radioactivity?
No.
Why not? I guess.
Well, radioactive waste is under provision statutorily for the Arkansas Department of Health. So if the radioactive waste was mixed with hazardous waste, obviously we would have the statutory law to be able to govern it. But if it's just radioactive waste in and of itself, we do not have that authority to deal with that. Yes.
I want to again thank all of you for spending the time today to come and learn more. I think, as I mentioned before, we are on a learning curve about this, but at the same time, I'm hoping that all of you will share the information with other people who could not be here today. Somehow the information just doesn't seem the same when you read it in the paper as when you hear it from someone who had been here. And so I want to thank very much the panel for their cooperation in bringing us so much information. The League of Women Voters produces a book called Government in Arkansas that we would like to make sure that each of our panelists have a copy of this. And these are publications that hopefully will help to show some of the structure of the state and help the projects you're involved in. Thank you again for helping us to produce this today.